We were told by our parents that if we had passion for the work we did, somehow the work and the money that came with the work would find us. And increasingly, it becomes clear that you have to actually split those two things apart. You have to choose professions where money can be made.
Welcome to The Portfolio Life. I'm Jeff Goins. This is the podcast that helps you pursue work that matters, make a difference with your art, and discover your true voice. And so today we're going to interview Louis Schiff. Louis works for Inc. magazine and works with a lot of small businesses all around the U.S., helping them grow as entrepreneurs. Why are we talking about this on The Portfolio Life? Because business is part of your art, and at a certain point, every artist, every creative person has to make a decision about whether or not they're going to continue to make war or make peace with the business side of their career. And in this interview, I think Louis makes some compelling reasons why even artists need to be concerned with how they're making a living and what they're doing to create value in the marketplace. So here's my interview with Louis. Hey, Louis, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. You and I have interacted a little bit online, but this is our first time having a conversation like this, so I'm excited about what we're going to learn from you. I think I first came across your book, Business Brilliant, from a friend of mine, Chris Crimmins, who owns a construction company, passed it on to me. We're often exchanging books and ideas, and he and I were out to dinner, and we were talking about these books that we were learning from, and I said, that sounds really interesting. And then afterwards, I went home, and like 2 days later, the book showed up on my doorstep because he's a generous guy like that. And I bought a copy of that book. I read it, and then I bought a copy of Business Brilliant for these 11 guys that I meet with every week in a mastermind group. And I have to tell you that first, when Chris introduced me to the book, there are parts of it where I was like, yeah, that's totally true. And there are other parts where like, oh my gosh, I don't know about that. And we had the same kind of reaction in the group where we read through it and discussed it every week, where some folks were like, yep, absolutely. And some folks were like, oh my gosh, is this really true? And I'm guessing that that's not a surprise to you.
Well, first of all, I want to know who paid for dinner between you and Chris.
Well, yeah.
I think you owe him a meal.
Right. Okay.
I probably owe him more than a meal.
Indeed.
Books are a funny thing. I won't dwell on the publishing industry too much, but people who read books are, and this is probably true of a lot of our kind of bifurcated culture we live in, a lot of the time they're trying to reinforce what they already believe to be true. So I don't know. It's a good question. How often in your life do you read a book or get some kind of volume of information that's really different than the way you think currently, and that you are willing to at least consider it, if not actually adopt it? I think the challenge with Business Brilliant will be that the book will be that we're asking people to think differently, and the readiness to think differently is not as prevalent as we all would wish it were.
Yeah, and let me say, I liked the challenges that were introduced in the book and the tension that it created for me. And I mean, basically, what you do in the book is backed by a lot of interesting research. You take a traditional idea that exists amongst the middle class, like, do what you love and the money will follow. And then you kind of tweak it or twist it and say, well, what do some of the wealthiest people in America and in the world, what have they actually done? And is this thing true? And you kind of test it against the data. And you came up with some surprising results, which I think is just fascinating. I love when you sort of begin, as I did with the book, with sort of these notions that you kind of have an idea of what success is supposed to look like. And then when you actually look at the evidence, you realize that some of the things that you've been believing, that I've been believing, aren't completely true. And so when you started this project, was there anything that surprised you along the way when you started doing this research?
I love learning about this research. I've not just for this book, I did it for a book prior called Middle Class Millionaire. And so I've been on, I would say, roughly a 10-year journey, 12-year journey now, where I've been looking at my own behaviors and surrounding myself with people who thought differently and who had obviously different results. And I'm happy to say over my 10 years, the results have changed for me as well. So I found it interesting. I found it surprising. I come from a family of, really straightforward middle class family, never wanted for anything, but never had much to begin with. And I have learned about how to acquire, how to build, how to accumulate wealth by reevaluating everything about the way I was raised. And that's the biggest issue. The biggest issue for everyone is we have this, I'm 44 years old, but let's just say you're between the age of 25 and 50. Your way of working, your way that you think that work and you interact is really formed in a very unique period of time, the sort of post-World War, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. And really, since the late 80s, the introduction of the computer, later on the introduction of the internet, the speed of communications, everything has changed. And so if you grow up in a household in the 50s through 80s, you have a way of thinking that is from a way of life that is, either it doesn't exist or it's rapidly disappearing. And how do you look at what was considered the conventional wisdom in your town, in your household, and then look at the data and then be willing to accept the fact that there is a huge gap between those two things?
Yeah. So I want to talk about 3 big ideas. The book basically consists of 9 chapters, and each chapter is a big idea. And you basically, feel free to correct me on this, but you basically did a survey where you interviewed a sample of middle-class people and then a sample of people who were multimillionaires and billionaires, and then you contrasted their answers to those questions, right?
Well, I would add to that that everybody in my millionaires and billionaires category started their lives out in the middle class. They're all self-made. Nobody in our survey, in our wealthy cohort, had received more than $50,000 from their families, including the cost of education. So they're all genuinely self-made people.
Awesome. So what's fascinating to me about this is I wear a lot of hats. I'm a writer, blogger, speaker. I write books. But more and more, I'm having to wear the entrepreneur hat, thinking in terms of now that I'm self-employed, I have this business to run, and there are opportunities to grow it, and there are opportunities to do the things that I love and to figure out how to grow and scale and reach more people. And it's fun, but it's all, it creates new tensions, and it's very different from working a day job thinking, oh, someday I'm gonna be out on my own doing my own thing. When you're in that reality, you face a lot of these lessons or opportunities to learn these lessons. And so I thought it would be good to talk about these 3 lessons that I want to pull from your book. There's a lot of them, but I think there's 3 that would be good for us to focus on, because I think the information isn't just relevant to business owners. Certainly, I think it's true for people who are entrepreneurs or entrepreneurially minded. But I think the general thing that I got from your book was success doesn't always look like what we think it looks like, and what we think will lead to success sometimes doesn't, and maybe often doesn't. And the 3 areas that spoke to me, the first was chapter 2, which is kind of the beginning of the research findings, where you ask people, I don't know exactly all the questions that you asked, but basically it was this idea of if you do what you love, the money will follow. And what you found surveying these self-made millionaires and billionaires was that they did what they love, but they followed the money. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So first of all, imagine, Jeff, as you just described, you've chosen this way of life. It has to do with being a writer, being a speaker. And there are probably people who will off the bat say, well, that's not the life I choose. I choose a 40-hour work week. I choose to work for a company, small, medium, large company. Let my employer worry about making sure that payroll can be met. I'm just going to make sure that I do my part. And I guess the first question or challenge to that is, do we even have the luxury of making that decision now? Of course, there are plenty of jobs out there, plenty of 9-to-5 jobs. There really are a lot of jobs out there, obviously, if you have the right skills for which jobs are needed. But rapidly, it's becoming to the point where you might have chosen that life, but other people are being forced into that decision, and the choice is being made for them. And so right off the bat, the question you ask, do what you love and the money will follow. We were told by our parents that if we had passion for the work we did, somehow the work and the money that came with the work would find us. And increasingly, it becomes clear that you have to actually split those two things apart. You have to choose professions where money can be made. You have to choose professions where there's a marketplace for what you do. So the obvious, simple example probably any of us could think of is if you know how to write computer code. All right, there's unlimited jobs for people who know how to write computer code. A lot of people are choosing that profession for the right reasons. It's because living doing it. Frankly, going one step farther to the thing that you cover and speak about, the portfolio life, that the idea that you could actually be a coder for multiple players, you could be a coder with multiple financial arrangements now, maybe you're getting stock options, maybe you're getting cash. And so right away you see this, making a decision to pursue something that you can monetize is a much smarter decision than saying, I'm going to choose something I'm passionate about and hope that the marketplace figures out my value.
So I think you told this story in this chapter, which it just stuck with me. You talk about the founding of Cirque du Soleil and how this was an opportunity for the team of La Liberté. I'm sure I didn't pronounce that right.
No, you got that right.
All right. The founder of Cirque du Soleil started out as a nonprofit, and then they kind of shifted the business model, and there was this opportunity for some of the employees, some of the people on his team to have some kind of ownership stake in it, and none of them took that opportunity. Can you expound upon that story a little bit? Because I just thought it was really fascinating. It was an interesting picture of this concept of it's not just either or. I think people think it's either I do what I love, I follow my passion, or I do what I hate for a paycheck. And this was an opportunity where some people, if they were smart, could have had both.
Right. So the reason we chose that story to open the book with is because it's a story of a clown, but let's just call this person an artist, just to put them in that category, because they're athletic and they work hard at what they do. But he was a clown, and he hooks up with a lot of other clowns along the way, and he starts to put together a circus troupe. Forget for a moment what we know about Cirque du Soleil as this mammoth global empire. He's basically accumulating people who share his passion. And very lucky, they happen to be from Quebec, and Quebec is celebrating its 400th anniversary. So there's money being shared by the government of Quebec to showcase all that Quebec has to offer. So these circus people get involved with this money. They basically get enough money for a tent, enough money for some training areas. It ends up becoming very popular, and it would have been the easiest thing in the world for those circus folks that we're talking about 20 or 30 people who ended up kind of coming together around this idea of something called Cirque du Soleil to say, why don't we become like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir or like the Los Angeles Philharmonic? Why don't we become a well-respected, well-regarded, not-for-profit that does what we love in the arts, and there's obviously an economy around all that. You can build a business like that, a not-for-profit business. That would be extremely natural, and that's the path they were headed on. Except Guy La Liberté, who's one of the clowns, kind of one of the leaders of the group, says, no, let's convert this into a for-profit enterprise. And he does it, and he alienates almost everyone who came with him because they're not in it for the money, they're in it for the passion. And he pushes it through anyway. He alienates some very important people in his life who had come up with him. One or two people came along with him. The rest of them were happy to just follow him into the next mode. And by that, I mean they just became employees of his. And so the question I raise in the book is, why didn't one of them, even one of them, think to ask for 1% of Cirque du Soleil as he converted it from a not-for-profit to a for-profit, because he was quite desperate for support and buy-in, and none of those folks who were part of the circus thought to ask for any. If you had 1% of Cirque du Soleil now produces more revenue than all of Broadway combined. It's a massive operation. Why didn't anybody in that group think to ask for a piece of equity? And you have to get deep into this difference between thinking that the money will follow you versus going out and looking for the money. The difference between those folks who did not ask is that they thought that as people who followed their passions, somehow an income would follow them. And the reality is that Guy La Liberté showed them a path to convert their passion into money, and they don't think that way, and they weren't interested, and in many ways they might have been, some of them were turned off by it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you calculated in the book that 1% stake in Cirque du Soleil would now be worth millions of dollars.
$20 million at the time, yeah.
It's incredible.
Sure.
Yeah, so
and he's a billionaire.
He's a billionaire. Yeah. And anybody who's seen that show knows that, I mean, that's art. It's way better than any local circus that comes into your town. I mean, it is an incredible performance. And I have a lot of friends who are artists. I consider myself an artist. I live in a town full of musicians and artists, and it's true that most of them are not interested in following the money. And you talk, part of the reason for that is this idea of the paralysis of the paycheck, that if I can guarantee income just kind of showing up, then I don't want to take more risk. And I think that was part of the fear with, these clowns. Is part of it, I think, was this artistic ideal that once you introduce money into the equation, you somehow minimize the artistic integrity of it. And the other is they just wanted a paycheck.
Right, but even expand beyond the arts, because the arts is a great place to zero in on because of what you just said. People don't go into it for the money. But let's just say you're a great cook. You love to cook for your family. And everyone says around you, you should open a catering company. You should open a restaurant. Why is it that so few people who translate their passion for something like cooking actually successfully manage to open a restaurant? And you get into this whole area of how what we called paycheck paralysis was really that once you're getting paid for something, not only do you minimize your interest in risk, but in some ways the paycheck becomes the cloak that is put over you that you cannot get out of, that you all of a sudden have replaced this passion for a paycheck and you actually take less pleasure from it. And there's just so much evidence that once people are receive something like a compensation for the things they used to love doing, it takes the joy out of it. They feel like they're being controlled now by their boss or by whoever's, calling the shots. And they turn a passion into a displeasure. And that's a huge decision-making point for so many people that you have to ask yourself, are you the kind of person who, once you're being paid to do something by somebody, it takes the pleasure away from it because you feel like it's their mission, not yours. It's, they're pulling the strings and you're the puppet. It's a deep, deep decision a lot of us have to make. But I can tell you that those who decide that there's great pleasure in doing things where you're paid well for it, actually find a way to create substantial wealth.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's one of the things that was freeing for me about beginning to understand my life as a portfolio is there are some things that I can do just for the pleasure of doing them that I don't have to convert into business opportunities. And yet at the same time, there are things that I love doing that if I got paid to do them, I would, still continue to love doing them. But I think you're absolutely right in that you've got to decide what that is. What I love about the Cirque du Soleil story is here was a guy who loved what he was doing. He was all in. He was willing to take the risk. He would have shared opportunities with other people probably, and yet nobody else wanted to. And because he took all of the risk, he's now reaping all of the reward, creating art for millions of people in this incredible business. And what I thought was interesting about it is if he had never converted from changing the model to a for-profit model, most likely it never would have grown to the size that it is now. And so sometimes taking that step and taking that risk is a way to get your work in front of many more people, not just make more money, but impact more lives, which I think is kind of cool.
I agree.
So, okay, let's move on to the second principle. Like I said, there's, I think, 8 of them in the book. But another one that jumped out to me is imitate, don't innovate. And I remember reading in the book that most people, I kind of believed this. I grew up, middle class. I think most people believe that if you had one great idea, like all you needed was one great idea that would change the world and you would become a millionaire.
Right.
People have these notions of Thomas Edison as this guy, sitting in a laboratory and just by himself figuring out how to create the light bulb, not understanding that he had a whole group of people working with him. And so what your research found was that really successful people are actually imitating more than they're innovating. Can you talk about that?
Right. Sure. So, some popular examples could be Steve Jobs and Apple. Certainly the one I use in the book is Bill Gates and Microsoft Windows, which, for those of us who remember the emergence of Windows, it was a complete ripoff of the Apple operating system. The Apple operating system was a complete ripoff of a Xerox experiment. But the point is, when you ask successful people, self-made millionaires, what's more important, having a big new idea or executing on a simple idea very well, they always choose the latter. They know that the difference between having ideas and executing on ideas is the whole game. So, we've got a lot of people out there looking for the next big idea. The reality is, if you can just execute on a simple idea better than the next guy, you have a shot at success. And the examples I use in the book are Kinko's. Kinko's was a copy shop. Nothing particularly inspiring about it. What they did is they introduced this idea of having a 24-hour copy shop, which was a relatively novel way of looking at things, and that the purpose of their copy shop was to create kind of a calm place to organize yourself, which is really where their value came in for people. So they were better than every other copy shop. The funny thing was when they went to 24 hours, the other hours they were open, let's just say, 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., it's not like business really picked up during 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. More people came in during regular business hours because they knew the store was going to be open during the off hours. So you have an execution of a very simple idea, switching to 24 hours, changes your relationship with your customers, changes the financial profile of that company. And the story is not just of Kinko's, but of other companies that try to make simple innovations inside their company, is that there's a lot of resistance to simple, small ideas. But everyone keeps looking for the big idea. And in fact, a lot of good fortune is to be found in executing small ideas well.
Why do you think people are sort of obsessed with the big idea?
Well, there's another piece of conventional wisdom. As you said, Thomas Edison, things were taught in school, the role of the inventor in society. But I think execution is a lot harder. Execution is about details. It's about diligence. So we have this startup culture. We have this culture. Nashville is a great example. It's a very, innovative town. But there's a startup culture out there now, right? There's incubators everywhere. There's people coming up with new apps and new things to do for business. And they talk about what? They talk about writing a business plan. They talk about raising capital. There's not a lot of talk about how do you sort of stick to it culture. There's not a lot of discussion about, okay, you start, you raise a couple bucks from friends and family, you put out the business plan, you write the first few lines of code, you get the product out there. Then guess what happens? The marketplace tells you we probably want it a little different. Maybe the marketplace doesn't respond as fast as you hope they would. This is really the moment that separates the weak from the strong. Are you willing to push past what Seth Godin calls the dip, the inevitable dip, when the marketplace doesn't respond exactly as you hoped it would, and you use that time to tweak, to focus, to ask questions, to listen? Much more important and a much bigger differentiator than whether you can start something.
So let's personalize this for a second, Louis. You're an author, amongst other things. I am too, and I always have ideas for books, and then I go out and read a bunch of books and then kind of get depressed because I realize, oh yes, somebody already had that idea. But, we consistently, I think, especially in kind of the genre that you're in kind of the business advice, nonfiction genre, we often see new tweaks on old ideas. What is the tension for you as an author in writing a book that you don't want to be the kind of author where somebody goes, there are no new ideas in this book, because that's not the kind of criticism you want to receive. But as we all know, there's nothing new under the sun, and it's not about having the best ideas. It's about executing on the ones already out there. How do you deal with that tension as an author? You don't want to be called some copycat, but at the same time, there is this wealth of data and information already out there.
Well, I guess specifically when it comes to something like a book, I write books based on original data. I have a long-time relationship with a researcher named Russ Prince, and he is a source of, I don't want, they're new ideas, but really it's more about ideas that are clarified or uncovered through data. Maybe the ideas existed and they were in the ether, but he could actually kind of grind them down into a numerical proof. But one of the ways I deal with that, by the way, is I tend not to read other business books, certainly not while I'm writing.
That's a good idea.
Because then you say, wow, that was so smart, I can't do it now because it was already in that book.
Yeah.
So I definitely don't read anything else while I'm doing that kind of writing and development. But I would say that, I happen to work with Inc. magazine, and I work in this community that's called the Inc. 5000 community. So every year we rate and rank the 5,000 fastest growing private companies in America. So literally every day I spend time with people who are great at execution. This is really the way to create wealth in America, is to just imitate and execute on a simple idea really well. And so I'm around people whose lives are good, who have employees whose families are well taken care of, who are really jazzed by the work they do because they're focused entirely on execution. And the world is rewarding them with money, with prestige and status and honoring them. And so I'm just surrounded every day by people who focus on execution and they don't dwell on big ideas. Because I'm part of that community, I don't think about big ideas anymore. I was at a college the other day speaking, and kids raised some questions. So they raised their hands, and they're entrepreneur students, and one says he wants to create a new social media platform. The other one says he wants to create a new beer, and the other one says he wants to create a new pair of jeans. And I just said, it doesn't really matter what your idea is in this room. It really matters. So start off with a pair of jeans and create a great pair of jeans, fine. It's really about following the marketplace. What do they want from you? What can you do better than the next guy? That's going to be where you find a way to create wealth and opportunity. And I don't really care where you start. It's about whether you stick with it and whether you listen to the marketplace and whether you are willing to focus on executing in ways that demonstrate that it's valuable to others and not worrying about whether you're recognized for your genius.
We've kind of created this dichotomy in between imitation and innovation, but when you tell the story of Kinko's, or you talk about what Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or any number of successful entrepreneurs have done, they have innovated, but they've, maybe we'll call it micro-innovation. It wasn't some big idea. They took some piece of technology or idea out there and then executed on it, better than everybody else, which is in its own way a form of innovation.
Absolutely. And innovation is an unfair word in this sense. Again, I'll just refer to the Inc. 5000 community. There is a tremendous amount of innovation that takes place in small, successful entrepreneurial endeavors. Only it's not in what you think it is. It's in how they compensate their workers. Look at Whole Foods, which made a decision in its earliest days to provide health care even to part-time workers. Now, that's an innovation. And that changed the way Whole Foods workers connected to and were engaged by their company. And Whole Foods, to use them as an example, Whole Foods focused on the supply chain, on how it delivers organic food all the way up through its supermarkets. And that innovation that had to take place in order to make a supply chain that could work effectively, that's where innovation took place. So there's constant innovation taking place inside companies. It's just that it's typically built around solving a problem. And to look at something like providing health care to part-time workers, which now is becoming, a regulated thing, whether or not you think it's good or bad. But it was born out of an idea that it could connect the workers more closely to the mission of the company. So he was solving a business problem. And he was also, in the course of it, solving a social problem or supply chain management. Over and over again, we see that it's solving business problems lead to the kind of innovation that I think we all do appreciate, but we don't celebrate quite as much as the person who invents the new widget that no one ever saw before.
Absolutely. The last principle I want to talk about with you is towards the end of the book, you talk about failure, and the title of that chapter is Nothing Succeeds Like Failure. And I thought this was, I know that there are these great stories of epic failure that eventually lead to success, but when you talk about how, what that actually looks like in a person's life, setbacks, bankruptcy, many of the people who have succeeded in the world at some point faced an epic failure and didn't let that deter them. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I would go further. Not only did it not deter them, it actually became the foundation for their next effort.
Wow.
So, we'll use Thomas Edison again, the famous saying, that it took him 1,000 attempts to get the light bulb right. And his response was, no, I discovered 999 ways that it doesn't work. So how much time and energy does it take, and how many failures does it take in order for you to discover the way that will finally work? That's the question. It kind of goes back to what Seth Godin calls the dip, whether or not you're willing to push through the inevitable feedback or blowback from the marketplace. Failure is very importantly responsible for so many success stories. So I'll use Steve Jobs as an example again, actually, because Steve Jobs, most people totally misunderstand Steve Jobs' wealth creation. I'm not talking about his legacy, but his wealth creation. If you ask, 10 people on the street, they'll tell you he made all his money from Apple. It's not true. He made most of his money from Pixar. He started Pixar kind of after he got kicked out of Apple the first time, kind of to prove to the world that he could actually do something in a related field and be just as successful as Apple was. He created these sort of industrial computers that were meant to be used by universities and hospitals to do 3D imaging. And nobody was interested and nobody was buying these things. And so he hired a very small animation department to demonstrate what the software could do in the area of 3D imaging. And the next thing he knew, he had an animation department that was sort of demoing the software, but was kind of twiddling their thumbs because not enough people were buying. So he said to the animation department, you guys got to figure out a way to make a little money. And next thing he knew, they were selling their time to make commercials. Eventually they made movies. Eventually they became the powerhouse Hollywood blockbuster film company called Pixar that got sold to Disney. And then Steve Jobs made about $4 billion from that transaction. So he leaves behind a legacy where he went into this one field. You know, what he did right in Pixar was not that he knew anything about Hollywood or animation, but that he knew that if he kept looking for the opportunity in this endeavor with this collection of bright people, he would eventually find it. And he went through failure after failure after failure until it emerged. It's an interesting story because I think Steve Jobs' biggest contribution is not necessarily the creation of Pixar. It's really some of the wonderful tools he's left behind for us to play with. But it's a good example of how somebody like that can create such a tremendous success in such a kind of surprising way, and in a way that doesn't really get recognized in his story or in the public understanding of his story.
Yeah, totally. And having read the Steve Jobs biography and been a bit of an Apple fanboy for a little while, I wonder if he didn't become the CEO of Pixar and kind of take that deal over after Next Computer, if he would have had the ability to go back and lead Apple and kind of save them from bankruptcy, because it seemed that was sort of the training ground for his eventual success at the company that he started, was coming back and learning how to be a CEO and then coming back and leading Apple.
So this is the gap between, and it's a kind of, this is our theme, right? Which is that when the conventional wisdom is in conflict with the data. And so the data tells us that pushing through failure, multiple failures, is a path to success. But the conventional wisdom, or let's say the popular legend of somebody like Steve Jobs, is that he was, sitting in a lab and he kind of came up with the iPod and he came up with the iPad and came up with the interface of Mac OS. And that's the story he wants us to know. And I'm not knocking the guy, and may he rest in peace. And if you do read the Walter Isaacson biography about Steve Jobs, that's the story Steve Jobs wants to leave behind. It's a story that sells well. I don't mean that he sold his book necessarily or a story, but it was the story that made people want to know what he was doing next. It was a story that made people want to interview him and ask him, what was on his mind. The real story is a business brilliance story. It's about a guy who was really focused on what he did best, which was sitting in a lab or sitting in a kind of a workspace and helping engineers build products for creative people and just being the bridge between those two groups. Yeah. And the real story is that he was a great earner. He basically focused on making money. When he went back to Apple in his second go-around, he got no salary whatsoever. He took it all in stock. How many of us are prepared to back up our interests by putting ourselves in an equity position? The real story is that he pushed through failure. And so you ask yourself, what are the popular stories about wealth creation out there, and what might be the truth behind them? And I submit that when you study 800 households, 400 of them are started in the middle class and stayed in the middle class, and 400 of them started in the middle class and came out as millionaires, multimillionaires, and billionaires. And you just ask the very simple question, what are you doing to create wealth? Now you have a gap. You have a dividing line between those whose practices around wealth creation have not helped them accumulate any wealth and whose practices around wealth creation have helped them accumulate wealth. And if you decide that you want to stick with the conventional wisdom, you shouldn't be surprised when you get a conventional result, which is that you stay in the middle class. But if you want to look at data clear-eyed and honestly with rigor, and accept it for what it is, which is a snapshot in how it can be done, it's your choice. But I think if you spend a lot of energy saying, I don't want to look at that data because I have come to believe through the way I was raised or the popular stories I embrace that this is how it's done, that's your choice. It's not data driven.
Was there anything in writing Business Brilliant that either surprised you or influenced the way that you were living your life, building your own portfolio of work, and pursuing wealth?
Absolutely. So much. I mean, I'm frequently asked, so one of the things I focus on is what are you really, really good at? And I think almost every successful person you'll meet will tell you that they know a lot about what they're good at, and they try and do as much of that as possible. And so many of us in the rest of the world will spend time trying to be well-rounded and working on our weaknesses and all these things that take us away from what we're really good at. And I have learned to focus on what I'm good at because it's actually a process of trial and error. It's a process of self-discovery. And the faster you can learn about what you're really good at and spend more time doing it, the more likely you are to build wealth. So I would say among the many things I've learned, one of the things I've really focused on is trying to spend my career and my time in the workplace doing as much as possible about what I'm really good at.
Yeah.
Simple, but profound.
Totally. And I think, what was interesting about the book is a lot of the values and qualities that we attribute to the middle class, both of which, you and I are from, the idea of you're just going to figure it out, you're going to overcome weakness, you're going to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you're going to try harder. Business Brilliant explores those ideas and seems to suggest that some of those values are actually what's holding people back from the kind of success that they dream of.
Sure. I was with a very, very successful person about a week ago, and he pulls me over at some point and he tells me a secret, what he thinks is a secret. I happen to know the data, so it's not such a secret to me. He says, this is a guy with hundreds of millions of dollars. He says, luck is a really important part of success. Yeah. And, so here's a guy who's being honest, and he's choosing me to be honest with because of the work I do. But the reality is, just as an example of how counterintuitive all of this is, almost every successful, wealthy person will tell you that luck is a huge part of how they got successful. And not luck in a sarcastic or cynical way, like, boy, that guy must be lucky. It's really that it's actually a functional component of success. So it's just one example of how the ingredients that make you successful, they're there for the seeing and for the taking, but you have to change your orientation towards them in order to really make them work for you.
Yeah, I love Jim Collins talked about that in Great by Choice in demonstrated data that basically said everybody gets lucky, but really successful people, truly great companies do something with that luck. And
exactly.
I saw that in a lot of the stories in Business Brilliant. Opportunity comes, luck happens, but the people who succeed are the ones who take that and do something with it.
Right. So now we have the sort of the frustrating question or the frustrating moment, which is, we're surrounded by all this opportunity all the time. We're surrounded by people we care about. We want them to be successful. One truth about everyone I surveyed is that they all want to be wealthier than they are. And the other truth is that even rich people, they all want to be wealthier than they are. And then you ask them why they want to be wealthy, and it's almost always the exact same answer. I want to make my family's life better. So it's a pretty honest and not crazy definition of why they're doing what they do. And then you have this frustrating, almost heartbreaking moment of if you want it and you want to do good things with your success and it'll help your family and the people you care about, why are you working so hard to be not successful?
Yeah.
Putting so much energy, working so hard and not looking at the data, not looking at the opportunity clear-eyed. It becomes heartbreaking in a way.
Yeah, it does. Louis, it's been a pleasure. I could talk to you all day. Thanks so much for your time. Again, the theme that I felt was kind of emerging from reading the book and then you and I talking is the things that you think are going to lead to success might not. And so you need to re-examine some of your thoughts on what you're doing and some of your actions that you think are going to lead somewhere that might not. If you want to find out more about Louis, I highly recommend you pick up his book, Business Brilliant. I think my wife has told me I can't buy any more copies for people, so you have to go buy your own copy. The book is Business Brilliant, and you can find Louis online at business-brilliant.com. Louis, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for sharing these great ideas with your community.
Totally my pleasure.
Won't you roll the dice so I can know which way I should go?
Thank Thank you for listening to another episode of The Portfolio Life. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Louis Schiff and that you started applying some of the principles that he talked about. Please go pick up a copy of his book, Business Brilliance, and buy one for a friend as well. Books are a great gift, and they're a great investment in those that you care about. If you're enjoying the show, I would love a review on iTunes. It helps us continue to thrive and grow, and it also helps my ego. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.
I have learned to focus on what I'm good at because it's actually a process of trial and error. It's a process of self-discovery. And the faster you can learn about what you're really good at and spend more time doing it, the more likely